It was the fall of 2012, and I was 29 years old, desperate for a break from the non-stop buzz of the city. I worked in a small tech company in Seattle, where days blurred into nights with little difference. I had grown tired of the endless meetings, the constant hum of fluorescent lights, and the claustrophobia of apartment life. So when I found an affordable cabin rental in the Cascade Mountains, about 80 miles east of Seattle, I jumped at the chance. The cabin was rustic but cozy, tucked away on the edge of a dense pine forest, near a small lake called Silver Pine. The owner advertised it as the perfect spot for solitude and reflection. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just nature and quiet. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed a few essentials: clothes, a small bag of groceries, my journal, a flashlight, and a heavy-duty pocket knife I always carried. The drive out was slow and winding, the road turning from asphalt to gravel as I got closer. The further I went, the thicker the trees became, towering and darkening the sky. I loved it. Arriving at the cabin around late afternoon, the sun was already low. The structure was small but solid, a one-room cabin with a stone chimney and a small porch. The windows were dusty, and the wood smelled faintly of pine and old smoke. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds sang. No wind rustled the trees, just a stillness that settled heavy in the air. I unlocked the door, stepping inside. The cabin was dim but warm, thanks to a small wood stove in the corner. There was a bed against one wall, a rough wooden table, and a couple of shelves filled with old books and a few canned goods. A single bulb hung from the ceiling but didn't work. I unpacked my things and lit a fire in the stove. The flame flickered and cast long shadows, the only movement in the still room. After dinner, I sat by the fire, writing in my journal and listening to the quiet. The lake was only a short walk away, and I planned to explore it the next day. Outside, the sun sank completely, and night wrapped itself around the cabin like a thick blanket. I shut the curtains and settled into bed, the wood creaking softly as the wind picked up. The first night passed without incident, but I woke several times to strange sounds. Branches snapping outside, the distant howl of a coyote. Nothing alarming, just the noises of the wilderness. I told myself it was all normal. The next day, I explored the area, walking the trail along the lake's edge. The water was still, reflecting the fiery reds and golds of autumn leaves. I gathered some dry wood and took mental notes of the cabin's surroundings. The steep incline of the ridge behind it, the dense thicket of trees blocking the northern side, and an old dirt road leading further into the forest. When I returned, the sun was already dipping again, and the chill crept in. I made another fire and cooked a simple meal. The wind howled outside now, rattling the cabin walls and shaking the windows. I closed the shutters tightly and curled up with my journal. That night, the sounds grew louder. Something was moving outside. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and slow, crunching over fallen leaves and dry twigs. It wasn't an animal, not the small sounds of a deer or squirrel. This was something bigger, heavier, closer. I stayed frozen under my blanket, heart pounding in the dark. The footsteps circled the cabin, pausing, then moving again. It went on for what felt like hours. My flashlight sat on the table, useless because I was too afraid to move. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. I stayed awake, staring at the door, waiting for the first sign of movement. At dawn, I ventured outside, flashlight in hand. The ground around the cabin was trampled. I saw heavy boot prints in the soft earth, circling the porch, almost like someone was watching or waiting. But who would come out here, and why? The thought stayed with me all day, gnawing at my nerves. I told myself maybe it was hunters or someone else staying in the woods, but the feeling of being watched never left. That night was worse. The wind picked up again, but now I heard something else. Soft voices in the distance, low murmurs carried on the breeze. The cabin seemed to shrink around me. Every shadow was a threat, every creak a warning. Suddenly, a loud bang shattered the silence. Something hit the cabin's wall outside hard, heavy. I jumped up, heart racing, grabbed my knife, and moved to the window. Peering through the cracked curtain, I saw nothing but darkness. The banging came again, louder, more aggressive. It was like someone was trying to break in. Panic surged through me. I shoved a chair under the doorknob, locked every lock, and waited. The pounding stopped after a few minutes, but the fear stayed. I spent the night huddled near the fire, flashlight ready, ears straining for any sound. Morning came with pale light, and I stepped outside carefully. Near the back of the cabin, I found a large rock resting against the wood wall. Fresh dirt beneath it, signs it had been thrown or placed there recently. No footprints this time, but the rock was a clear message. Someone had been here, watching, threatening. I packed what I could carry quickly, my bag, some food, water, the knife. I knew I couldn't stay. The nearest town was still miles away, and my phone had no signal. I decided to take the dirt road leading out, hoping it connected to a main road. The walk was tense. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing back, expecting to see someone, or something, following me. Halfway down the road, I saw a figure standing between the trees, barely visible in the early morning fog. The person didn't move but watched me. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs. Suddenly, the figure turned and vanished into the woods. I didn't wait to see more. I broke into a run, stumbling over roots and rocks, desperate to get away. After what felt like hours, I finally reached a ranger station. The rangers were shocked to hear my story. They told me that the area had recently seen a rise in illegal hunters and squatters, people who camped without permission, sometimes threatening others. They said some of these groups were territorial and dangerous, especially to strangers. I filed a report and stayed with the rangers until someone could drive me back to town. I never returned to the cabin. The experience stayed with me for years. The silence of the forest, the weight of being watched, the sense of helplessness. The cabin at Pine Ridge was supposed to be a retreat, a place to find peace, but instead, it showed me how vulnerable you can be when you're alone, surrounded by strangers and wild things. In the end, I realized some places hold secrets not because of ghosts or legends, but because of real people, and sometimes the scariest things are human. The forest itself was just trees and animals. The danger was human, real, present, and terrifying. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. Looking back now, it feels like a story I could only ever tell after it was all over, after the danger passed and the fear finally loosened its grip. It was late fall 1998 when I took the trip that changed everything. I was 28 years old then, and eager for a break from city life. The pace of New York was wearing me down. The constant noise, the crowded streets, the blaring horns. All of it felt like a cage closing tighter every day. I needed silence, fresh air. I needed to disappear for a while, just to breathe. That's how I ended up renting a small cabin deep in the Adirondack Mountains, a place I had never been before but always dreamed about. The ad said it was rustic, quiet, off the grid, just the kind of escape I wanted. The cabin was near a small lake called Clearview Pond, a secluded spot surrounded by thick pine forests and rolling hills. The closest town, Ticonderoga, was more than 30 miles away. I booked the place for a week, telling myself it would be a week of rest and reflection. I drove north from the city early on a chilly October morning. The sun was still low on the horizon, and the roads were lined with trees flashing shades of red, orange, and gold. The changing leaves were beautiful, a sign that winter was just around the corner. As I left the last stretch of highway behind and turned onto a narrow dirt road, the air grew cooler and smelled of pine and earth. I hadn't seen another car in a long time. The final few miles were rough. The road was full of potholes and fallen branches, and it wound through dense woods that blocked the sky almost completely. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I felt an immediate wave of calm wash over me. The cabin was small, no more than 400 square feet, made of dark wood that had weathered the years. It sat just a few feet from the water's edge. The pond was still and glassy, reflecting the gray sky and bare branches above. I got out of the car and stretched. The air was crisp, and the silence around me was profound. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Felt like the world was holding its breath. The cabin door creaked as I opened it, and a faint musty smell greeted me. Dust floated in the shafts of light through the windows. Inside, there was a small fireplace, a cot, a wooden table, and a few shelves lined with old books and canned food. No electricity, no running water. A simple bucket outside served as a toilet. I spent the afternoon unpacking and exploring the area. The forest was thick with tall pines and maples, their leaves mostly fallen to the ground. The underbrush was dense, and I had to be careful where I stepped to avoid hidden roots and loose rocks. I found a trail that led deeper into the woods but decided not to go far. I was here to rest, not to get lost. As evening fell, I gathered firewood from the pile near the cabin and built a fire in the stone hearth. The flames flickered and cast dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and I could hear the occasional splash from the pond. Maybe a fish jumping or a frog diving under. The air was cold enough that I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I sat on the cot with a book and tried to relax. That night, I slept fitfully. The cabin creaked as the wind picked up, and somewhere outside, branches snapped. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the sounds of the forest. But in the dark, every noise felt sharper, more urgent. I remember lying awake for hours, staring at the dark ceiling, wondering what I had gotten myself into. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The sky was still dark, but a faint pink glow was spreading over the horizon. I made coffee over the fire and stepped outside to watch the sun rise. Mist hovered over the pond, swirling slowly before dissolving in the light. The forest was peaceful again. I decided to hike the trail a bit more that day, packing a small backpack with water, a map, a flashlight, and some snacks. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, with rocks and roots that made footing tricky. I moved slowly, careful not to slip on the wet leaves. About 2 miles in, I stopped at a clearing that overlooked the pond from above. The view was breathtaking, the water shimmering below, framed by trees still holding onto their autumn colors. As I turned to head back, I noticed something odd on the path behind me. Footprints in the dirt. They were fresh, maybe a few hours old, and looked like they belonged to heavy boots. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived, so it made me uneasy. The prints led further into the woods, not back toward the cabin or the road. I debated whether to follow them, but a part of me told me not to. I wasn't equipped for anything serious, and the forest was already isolating enough without another unknown presence. I took a mental note of the footprints, then hurried back to the cabin. That night, the unease grew. The wind outside had picked up again, rattling the cabin windows and stirring the trees. I sat close to the fire, trying to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. I thought I saw movement in the shadows, a flicker of something just beyond the tree line. Every time I looked, it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination. The forest played tricks when the light was low. But deep down, I felt watched. The footprints on the trail, the noises outside, the shifting shadows. They all pressed on my mind like a weight. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake, listening. Around midnight, a loud crash echoed through the woods, like a tree limb breaking or something heavy falling. It was close, too close. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed a small hunting knife I had brought for safety and moved quietly to the window. Outside, the forest was dark and still again. I waited for a long time, every muscle tense. When nothing else happened, I slid down to the floor, exhausted, but unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. In the morning, I found more signs. Near the edge of the clearing by the cabin, there were more footprints. This time, they were closer, maybe 20 yards from the cabin door. Someone had been watching. The prints were larger than mine, heavy boots with deep treads. I checked the cabin carefully. Nothing was missing or broken, but the back door that led to the storage shed was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it. Inside the shed, I found the firewood disturbed. Some pieces scattered on the ground as if someone had searched through the pile. No sign of who, but it was clear I wasn't alone. Fear settled over me like a cold blanket. I considered leaving right then, but the nearest town was hours away, and the dirt road was rough. My car was parked far down the road. Still, the feeling of being watched was now undeniable. The rest of that day was tense. I stayed close to the cabin, keeping the fire going and scanning the trees constantly. The forest that had seemed so beautiful and peaceful now felt like a trap. Every sound made me jump: a rustle in the brush, a bird taking flight, the distant cry of an animal. I kept my knife close and a large stick by the door. When night fell, I barricaded the doors as best I could and layered wood against the windows. I knew it was mostly symbolic. The walls of the cabin wouldn't stop someone determined, but it gave me some small comfort. I didn't sleep that night either. I took turns watching the windows and trying to rest on the cot. The fear gnawed at me relentlessly. What if someone was out there, waiting? What if they wanted to do harm? On the morning of the fourth day, I noticed something strange by the pond. A small, crude campfire site with blackened stones and ashes. It wasn't mine. Someone had been there very recently, maybe the night before. I searched around and found some empty cans and a torn piece of cloth snagged on a branch. This wasn't a random hiker. Someone was living close by or visiting without my knowledge. I began to realize that the forest wasn't as empty as I thought. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. I considered packing up and leaving immediately, but something held me there. I wasn't ready to give up just yet. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe I needed to prove to myself that I could handle the isolation and fear. Late that afternoon, as I was gathering water from the pond, I saw a figure moving at the edge of the trees on the opposite shore. It was a man, tall, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He didn't call out or wave. He just stood there, watching. I froze. The knife in my pocket suddenly felt too small. The man's presence was unsettling. I quickly turned and moved back toward the cabin, trying not to show fear. I spent the rest of the day inside, watching the woods carefully. The man never appeared again, but his presence was like a shadow hanging over the place. I didn't know if he was dangerous, friendly, or just passing through, but it didn't matter. I didn't trust it. By the fifth day, I knew I had to leave. The peace I had hoped for was gone, replaced by constant tension and fear. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. I packed quickly, loading my things into the car and checking every corner of the cabin for signs of intrusion. Everything. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a break from city life and spend some time alone in the woods. After months of grinding through work, deadlines, and constant noise, I needed a change. A quiet place where I could think and rest, somewhere untouched by the busy world. I found a small rental cabin in a place called Cedar Hollow, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina. It wasn't fancy, just a simple, old wooden cabin built in the 70s, with a stone chimney, a small porch, and a rusted metal roof. Perfect for what I wanted. I was 29 years old then, living alone for the first time since college. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from my apartment in Charlotte. Not too far, but far enough to feel like I was somewhere else. I remember the day I drove out there like it was yesterday. The air getting fresher as I left the city behind, the road winding through dense forests, and the way the sun filtered through the thick canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows on the road. The owner of the cabin had warned me there was no cell service out there, and that the nearest store was about 20 miles away. I took it as a good thing, no distractions. I packed enough food and water for a week, along with some books, a journal, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I also brought a heavy-duty knife and a small hatchet just in case. When I arrived, the place looked even more isolated than I expected. The gravel driveway was overgrown, and the wooden steps leading to the porch creaked under my weight. I unlocked the front door, and the smell of old pine and dust hit me. The inside was simple, one large room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, and a lofted bedroom above. There was a rickety wooden table and a couple of chairs. I liked it. Quiet, still, real. That first evening, I lit a fire in the wood stove and sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the ridges. the sky turning colors I hadn't seen in a long time. The only sounds were the distant call of birds and the rustling of the wind through the leaves. I felt calm. The first few days passed slowly but peacefully. I went on short hikes around the cabin, exploring small creeks and mossy rocks, collecting wildflowers, and trying to write in my journal. At night, the darkness was thick and absolute, broken only by the flicker of the fire or the occasional glow of distant lightning. The stars seemed closer here, brighter. On the fourth day, though, things began to feel different. That afternoon, while I was chopping wood for the stove, I heard a sharp crack coming from the woods beyond the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a falling branch or maybe a deer moving through the underbrush. But then the sound repeated. Another crack, closer this time. It made my skin crawl. I stopped what I was doing and scanned the treeline. The trees stood still, their leaves barely moving in the faint breeze. The forest looked peaceful, but the noise was too loud, too deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination. Maybe a bear or a coyote. Animals I'd heard were common in the area, but I was alone, miles from anyone else, and I didn't like that sudden weight of awareness settling in my chest. That night, I made sure to lock all the windows and doors, double-checking each one with shaky hands. I sat by the fire stove, knife beside me, flashlight ready. The cabin felt colder, somehow less welcoming. The wind picked up around midnight, howling through the cracks in the cabin walls. I listened closely, heart pounding. Then, faint but clear, I heard footsteps outside. Soft, deliberate footsteps stepping carefully across the dry leaves on the porch. I held my breath, staring at the front window. The beam of my flashlight swept the edge of the clearing, but nothing moved. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found signs of someone, or something, having been there. The front porch was littered with small twigs and crushed leaves that hadn't been there before. More disturbingly, near the edge of the porch, there were deep footprints pressed into the soft earth. Large, heavy, and unmistakably human. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach twisting. No one was supposed to be this far out. The cabin was private, with only a rough dirt road leading in. I hadn't heard any cars or people since I arrived. Whoever had been there had come on foot, and they had been close, too close. I considered leaving right then, but something stopped me. The forest had a way of pulling me in, even with the fear clawing at my mind. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably just a hunter or a camper passing through. I didn't want to admit I felt trapped. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could, wedging boards under the windows, tying the door shut with rope, and keeping my hatchet close. I tried to keep busy, but every shadow and noise made me jump. Later that evening, as I sat by the fire, I heard it again, the footsteps outside. This time, they circled the cabin slowly, crunching leaves and snapping small branches. I heard a faint scraping sound on the porch railing, like nails dragging lightly across wood. I shone my flashlight at the window just in time to see a shadow moving across the porch. My heart stopped. I gripped the knife tighter and backed away, ready to defend myself if needed. But the figure didn't try to break in. The footsteps stopped, then retreated slowly into the woods. I listened until the sounds faded completely. I didn't speak to anyone about it. There was no one to call anyway. My only company was the darkness. The fifth day was the worst. I woke to a loud banging on the front door. Hard, rapid, and urgent. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move at first, too stunned to react. The banging continued, a frantic hammering that echoed through the quiet cabin. I grabbed the knife and moved toward the door, heart racing. Whoever it was didn't say anything, didn't call out or identify themselves, just banging. My hands trembled as I looked through the small window beside the door. No one was there. The banging stopped as suddenly as it started. I opened the door cautiously, peering into the empty clearing. The only evidence was a broken branch lying on the ground, snapped roughly near the base. I closed the door quickly and locked it again, my mind racing. Who was out there? What did they want? And why did they vanish without a word? That day, I kept the fire going, kept my weapons close, and didn't venture far from the cabin. I didn't even try to write in my journal. I sat in the corner, eyes darting to every sound. That night, a storm rolled in. Rain battered the roof, thunder shook the ground, and lightning lit up the dark sky. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the cabin as if it might come down. I was half asleep when I heard a new sound, tapping at the window. Not a loud banging, but a soft, steady tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. I froze. The window was on the side of the cabin, near the kitchen. I stayed still for what felt like hours, barely breathing, listening to the storm and the tapping. Then silence. When I finally worked up the courage to look, the window was empty. No footprints in the mud, no sign of anyone. The rain had washed away everything. The next morning, I packed my things quickly. I wasn't going to wait any longer. The last few days had drained me physically and mentally. I felt unsafe, trapped in the woods with someone watching me. I drove back down the dirt road, heart pounding each time I thought I saw something move in the trees. When I reached the main road, the relief was overwhelming. I stopped at the first gas station and called the rental owner. I told them everything, the noises, the footsteps, the banging, the tapping. They listened quietly and then explained something I hadn't known. The area around Cedar Hollow had a history of trespassers, drifters, and even some people who lived off the grid. They used the forest to hide, hunting illegally or avoiding the law. The owner apologized for not warning me more clearly and promised to increase security patrols. For me, the experience was a wake-up call about how vulnerable isolation could be. Looking back, I realized the scariest part wasn't any creature or ghost, but the fact that someone had been so close, unseen and unheard until they wanted to be noticed. The silence, the waiting, the uncertainty. That was the true horror. I never went back to Cedar Hollow. Instead, I learned to respect the woods differently. Isolation is powerful, but it's never truly empty. There are always eyes watching, footsteps nearby, and sounds you don't understand. I kept the journal from that trip. The pages are filled with careful notes and sketches of footprints, broken branches, and the layout of the cabin. Sometimes, when the night is quiet and the wind picks up outside my city apartment window, I remember the tapping at the window and the feeling of being watched. It's a memory that stays with me, a reminder that some places are better left alone, and some nights are better spent in the safety of company. If there's one thing I learned, it's this. When you step into the wild, you're never as alone as you think. And sometimes the scariest thing I didn't expect my weekend getaway to turn into the kind of experience I'd be thinking about for years afterward. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a quiet trip to Mill Creek Cabin, a small rental tucked deep in the forests of northern Idaho. I wanted some time off from work, some silence, away from the noise of the city, away from screens and people. That's all. I'm James, 32 years old, and I live in Spokane. Mill Creek Cabin was about 2 hours away, a little further than I'd wanted to drive, but I'd heard good things about it. The place was isolated, with no internet or phone signal, right on the edge of a dense forest and overlooking a small, slow-moving creek. The cabin was old, built maybe 50 years ago, but well-kept, with a wood stove for heat, a small kitchen, and just one bedroom. It had a dusty charm, with wooden floors creaking underfoot and walls lined with faded photographs of the surrounding land. It looked peaceful. When I pulled into the gravel driveway on that Friday evening, the sun was low and soft behind the trees. I opened the door and the cabin smelled of old pine and faint smoke from someone's previous fire. I dropped my bags, opened the windows for fresh air, and went to start a fire in the wood stove. It was chilly, the air sharp and fresh, and the silence felt thick in a way that I wasn't used to. No cars, no planes, no people shouting or dogs barking. Just the occasional rustle of leaves. I ate a simple dinner, canned soup heated over the stove, and settled into a chair near the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. The creek outside gurgled quietly, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out a few times. I felt relaxed. This was exactly what I wanted. Nothing, just quiet. I decided to go for a short walk before dark, to stretch my legs and maybe look around. The trail started just behind the cabin, winding through tall pines and thick underbrush. The forest floor was soft and damp, covered in moss and fallen leaves. The air smelled like earth and wet wood. It was calming. I wasn't gone long, maybe 20 minutes, when I noticed something that didn't fit. There were footprints on the soft mud near the creek's edge. Not my own, and definitely not animal tracks. They were large, booted prints, fresh, and leading away from the cabin deeper into the woods. I paused. It was strange. The cabin was supposed to be private, isolated. The rental owner had told me no one else came near it without permission. But here were clear signs that someone had been walking around the area, maybe even the cabin itself. I felt a little uneasy, but figured maybe it was a hunter or a hiker. It was still light out after all. I went back inside, locked the door, and double-checked the windows. Nothing looked disturbed. Maybe it was nothing. That night, I slept with the window slightly open and the wood stove glowing low. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a faint noise outside. It sounded like snapping twigs and soft footsteps. I froze, listening hard. The cabin was pitch dark, except for the glow of embers in the stove. My heart started beating faster. Whoever was outside was moving slowly, maybe circling the cabin. I stayed still, hoping it was an animal or maybe the wind. After a few minutes, the noises stopped. I didn't sleep well after that. I kept hearing small noises, faint shuffles, creaks, distant thumps. But I told myself it was just the forest, normal sounds in the night. The next morning, I found more signs that someone had been there overnight. On the porch, a small branch was broken and lay on the steps. Near the door, fresh boot prints pressed into the dirt and gravel. I checked all the locks again and made sure the windows were secure. I thought about calling the rental owner, but there was no phone signal, no way to get a message out from the cabin. I decided to stay calm and not overthink it. Maybe some local kids had been sneaking around, or a hunter was nearby. I made myself breakfast and then tried to focus on relaxing. Midday, I went for a longer hike, hoping to put some distance between myself and whatever had been lurking near the cabin. I followed a narrow trail alongside the creek, admiring the towering evergreens, the patches of bright wildflowers, and the occasional flash of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. The forest was alive, peaceful even, and I started to believe maybe I had just imagined some of the fears from the night before. But as I walked, I noticed something else. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked beside a tree. Not something natural, not random. It looked deliberate. A marker, maybe. I felt a chill. Then I saw more. Faint markings carved into the bark of some trees. Scratches and shallow gouges, not made by animals. It was almost like a message or warning, but I couldn't make sense of it. I decided I'd seen enough and started heading back to the cabin. That afternoon, when I returned, the feeling of unease came back strong. The sun was lower now, and shadows stretched long across the ground. I locked the door behind me and went straight to the window. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement, a figure slipping between the trees about 50 yards away. I grabbed the small knife I always carried on hikes, tucked it in my belt, and tried to stay calm. Night came fast. I built a bigger fire in the stove and stacked more wood beside it. I stayed awake most of the night, listening. The sounds returned, soft footsteps crunching leaves, branches snapping far off, low rustling that couldn't be explained by wind. I was certain someone was out there, watching, maybe waiting. Around 2 a.m., I heard something heavier this time. A solid thump against the cabin wall, like someone had hit it hard with a fist or a tool. My heart jumped into my throat. I stayed silent, holding my breath, waiting for what would come next. Minutes passed. The noises stopped. I considered leaving right then, but the dark outside was thick and the forest looked endless. I had no way to get a car quickly, no cell service to call for help, and no idea where the nearest road was. I wasn't even sure if I'd see another person for miles. I had to get through the night. The first light, I packed my things quickly. I decided to hike out early before anyone could come back. I checked all the doors and windows again. Everything was locked tight, no signs of forced entry. I took the marked trail back toward the main road, moving fast but carefully. Every few steps, I glanced behind me, convinced someone might be following. After an hour, I reached my car, parked near the edge of the forest. The relief was overwhelming. I didn't look back. Driving back to Spokane, I tried to make sense of what had happened. No one else had been at the cabin, but someone had been near, maybe even watching me. Why? I had no answers. No one had confronted me directly or stolen anything. It felt more like intimidation or a test, a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Back home, I reported the incident to the rental company. They told me no other renters had been at Mill Creek that weekend and that local police had received a few reports of suspicious activity in the area recently. They suggested I file a formal report. I did. In the weeks that followed, I stayed away from that part of the forest. The memories lingered, the quiet footsteps, the crashing against the cabin wall, the feeling of eyes watching through the trees. I never saw who was there. Maybe it was some local troublemaker, a hunter, or worse, someone who just wanted to scare a stranger. But I never went back. I didn't expect that trip to turn out the way it did. I thought it would be a simple, peaceful getaway, a chance to get away from the noise of the city, clear my head, and recharge. But that weekend at the cabin ended up being one of the scariest experiences of my life, and it's something I won't forget anytime soon. It all started in early October of 2018. I was 29 years old, and I had just finished a tough few months at work. The job was demanding, and I hadn't taken a real break in over a year. So when I found a small cabin for rent online, tucked away in the forests near the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon, I jumped on it immediately. The pictures showed a rustic but sturdy cabin. No electricity, no running water, just pure nature and quiet. It was exactly what I needed. I packed up my car on a Friday afternoon, just a backpack with essentials. A sleeping bag, some canned food, a small camping stove, water, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I also brought my phone, though I knew signal would be spotty at best. The drive was about 2.5 hours from Portland, mostly along winding mountain roads. The sun was setting by the time I finally turned off the main road and onto a dirt track leading deep into the forest. The last mile or so was rough. The road was narrow and overgrown in places, the trees pressing close to either side. It was so quiet out there, no other cars, no people. Just the sound of leaves crunching under my tires and the occasional call of a bird. I kept reminding myself this was what I wanted. A break from the busy world. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was already dark. The only light was from the fading sky and my flashlight. The cabin looked just like in the pictures. Small, made of dark weathered wood, with a stone chimney and a porch big enough for 2 chairs. There was a pile of firewood stacked neatly nearby. I grabbed my backpack and headed inside. The cabin was small but cozy, with a wooden table, 2 chairs, a small kitchen area with a sink, but no water hooked up, and a wood-burning stove. There was a single bed in the corner covered with an old but clean quilt. A few shelves held some cookbooks and a dusty old lantern. I was glad to see a small box of matches and some kindling by the stove. After lighting a fire, I cooked some canned chili on my camping stove and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. The forest was alive with sounds outside, the rustling of leaves, distant hoots of owls, the occasional snap of a twig. I reminded myself to relax. This was my time. I set the flashlight on the table and lay back on the bed, listening to the fire crackle. The air was cool, but the cabin was warm enough. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. That's when I first noticed it, the faint sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon moving through the brush. The steps were slow, deliberate, and soft, but definitely human-like. The dirt path leading to the cabin was barely visible in the moonlight. I sat up and listened closely, heart beating a little faster. The footsteps came closer, crunching on dry leaves and twigs. Then they stopped just outside the cabin door. I didn't move, not even breathing. The door was old and wooden, probably not very sturdy. I was alone, miles from the nearest neighbor. The footsteps stayed quiet for maybe a minute. Then they moved on slowly, away from the cabin and into the dark forest. I stared at the door for a long time, waiting, but nothing else happened. I told myself maybe it was just someone hiking late, lost or curious. I locked the door and made sure the fire was burning strong. I double-checked the matches and lantern, then tried to calm down. I told myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching the cabin. The next morning, the sky was gray and overcast. I made coffee on the camping stove and looked out the small window. The forest looked peaceful, but something felt different. When I stepped outside onto the porch, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the soft dirt just a few feet from the door. They weren't mine. They were fresh, and they led off into the trees. My stomach tightened. Someone had definitely been here. I spent the day exploring the area, trying to keep my mind off the footprints. The forest was beautiful, with tall fir and pine trees, a thick carpet of fallen leaves, and moss-covered rocks. There was a small stream nearby where I refilled my water bottle. I told myself I wasn't afraid, just cautious. But by late afternoon, I noticed something else. The firewood pile had been disturbed. Some logs were moved around, and a few small branches broken on the ground. It looked like someone had been preparing to start a fire near the cabin. Panic crept in. I grabbed my backpack and checked my phone signal again. Still no bars. I was completely isolated. That night, I stayed up by the fire, watching the windows and door. The footsteps came again, this time from different directions. I heard the snap of branches, low rustling, but no voices, no talking. Whoever it was didn't want to be seen. I tried to make noise by banging a metal pot, hoping to scare anyone away. The footsteps stopped for a while but resumed later, closer now. Sleep was impossible. The third day, I decided to hike back down to the main road to find help. I packed quickly, grabbed a flashlight and my water, and started down the dirt track. The forest seemed quieter now, but every shadow felt like someone watching. As I walked, I heard the footsteps again behind me, fast and crunching on leaves. I didn't look back but picked up my pace. The sound sped up too. I broke into a run, heart pounding, lungs burning. The road was still a mile away. I ran blindly through the trees, tripping over roots, stumbling down a small slope. The footsteps kept pace, getting closer. Fear was overwhelming. Suddenly, I burst out onto the road. There was no one behind me. I stopped, gasping for air, looking around desperately. The silence was thick. I walked quickly to the highway and flagged down a passing car. The driver was kind and agreed to take me to the nearest ranger station. At the station, I told the rangers about the cabin, the footsteps, the disturbed firewood, and how I felt watched and followed. They listened carefully but didn't dismiss me. They said other hikers had reported strange activity in that area. People trespassing, stealing from cabins, and sometimes worse. It was isolated and perfect for someone wanting to hide or cause trouble. The rangers offered to escort me back to the cabin with backup. That afternoon, we drove back together, 4 of us now. The forest was dense, and the cabin looked the same, but eerily quiet. We found footprints all around, some fresh, some old. Broken branches, discarded trash, and even a small campfire ring just a few hundred feet away. One ranger explained these were signs of squatters, people who lived illegally in the woods, sometimes dangerous and desperate. We searched the area thoroughly but found no one. I packed up quickly with their help and left the cabin for good. On the drive back, I kept replaying every sound, every shadow from those nights. I realized how vulnerable I had been out there alone. The quiet I thought I wanted had been broken by something I couldn't see but felt deeply. It wasn't ghosts or monsters from stories. It was real people, real danger, strangers in the woods who didn't want me there. Since then, I've never stayed alone in a cabin that isolated. I still love nature, but I'm far more cautious now. That weekend taught me how easily things can go wrong when you're alone and out of reach. The woods are beautiful, but they can also hide threats you never expect. It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to take a week off and head up to the mountains alone. I needed a break from everything. The noise of the city, the endless routine of work, the crowded streets. I was 27 then, working in a small printing shop in Portland, Oregon. The city was loud, and I liked it that way sometimes, but this time I needed silence, complete silence. So I rented a small cabin near the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, roughly 60 miles east of Portland. The cabin was a modest wooden structure, nothing fancy. It sat near the edge of a dense forest, beside a narrow gravel road that wound through the trees. A small creek ran a few yards behind it, its water cold and clear, rushing over smooth stones. I remembered the realtor saying the place was perfect for someone who wanted to disconnect and get back to nature. No phone, no internet, no electricity, just a wood stove, a kerosene lamp, and a little propane stove for cooking. I arrived late on a Sunday afternoon. The sun was dipping low behind the tall pines, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. I parked my old Toyota pickup on the gravel and dragged my bags inside. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. I set down my bags and lit the wood stove, feeling the warmth spread slowly through the room. The cabin was small, maybe 400 square feet, with a single room that served as kitchen and living area, and a tiny loft above where I planned to sleep. The furniture was basic: a small wooden table, 2 chairs, and a battered armchair next to the stove. I had brought a stack of books and enough canned food for the week. The plan was simple: read, hike, fish in the creek, and just be alone. The first 2 days passed without incident. I woke early each morning to the sound of birds and the gentle rush of the creek behind the cabin. Mornings were cool and damp, with mist rising from the forest floor. I'd make coffee on the propane stove, sit outside on the small porch, and watch the light move through the trees. The forest was alive. Chipmunks scurried through the underbrush, squirrels called out, and once, I saw a lone deer step quietly across the clearing before melting back into the shadows. The hikes I took were peaceful and restorative. The trails were narrow and sometimes overgrown, but well marked. I found a few good fishing spots along the creek and caught enough trout for dinner one evening. At night, I'd sit by the stove, reading by lamplight until the fire burned low. But on the third night, things started to change. That evening, as I was settling in after dinner, I noticed something odd. The forest seemed quieter than usual, too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the bushes, nothing. Even the creek sounded muted, as if something was holding the silence. I shook off the feeling and went outside to get some fresh air. The sky was clear, full of stars, and the moon was just a sliver, barely lighting the path in front of me. As I stood on the porch, I thought I heard a faint noise in the distance, like footsteps on gravel. I froze, listening hard. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe the wind moving leaves around. But then, as I turned to go back inside, I caught a flicker of movement between 2 trees. Something or someone was watching. My heart jumped, and I stood very still, trying to see clearly. The night was too dark, but I thought I saw a shadow shift. I hurried inside and locked the door behind me. I checked the windows, they were all closed. The cabin felt suddenly very small and vulnerable. I tried to calm down by lighting the lamp and reading some more, but the feeling of being watched stuck with me. The next day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I kept the doors locked and only stepped outside for short bursts, always scanning the woods around me. The silence was now oppressive. No birds sang, no animals stirred. It was like the forest had been emptied out. In the afternoon, I noticed something else: footprints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They were large and fresh, leading from the trees toward the cabin, then circling around it. I followed them carefully, noting how deep the impressions were in the soft earth. Whoever made them was heavy, walking slowly, as if stalking or looking for something. I didn't know who it could be. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the gravel road hadn't seen a car all day. The footprints didn't match any animal I knew, too big for a bear, too regular for a deer or elk. I felt exposed, vulnerable. My first thought was to call the sheriff, but the cabin had no phone line, no cell signal either. I was completely isolated. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lamp burning low and stayed close to the stove. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps crunching on gravel outside, this time much closer. My heart raced. I crept to the window and peered out. In the dim light, I saw a figure standing near the edge of the porch, half hidden behind a tree. He was tall and wearing a dark jacket and a cap. I couldn't see his face. The figure didn't move for several minutes, then slowly stepped back into the woods and disappeared. I sat back, stunned. Someone had come to the cabin at night. What did they want? Were they dangerous? I had no idea. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, eager to leave. But as I opened the door, I froze. The figure was standing just across the clearing, watching. This time, I saw him clearly. He was a man in his 40s, rugged, with a grizzled beard. His eyes were sharp and cold. We held each other's gaze for a long moment before he turned and melted into the trees again. I locked the door, grabbed my bags, and sat down to think. There was no way I could leave without walking past that man. I wasn't even sure if he was alone. I spent the next few hours trying to decide what to do. I considered hiking out through the forest, but the terrain was thick, steep, and unfamiliar. I wasn't a hunter or a woodsman. I only knew the marked trails, and the man could be anywhere. Around noon, I heard a faint engine noise coming from the gravel road. I ran to the porch and saw a dusty pickup truck approaching. It was the neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Linda, who lived a few miles down the road. She stopped and waved, noticing the tension on my face. I explained as much as I could without alarming her, pointing toward where I'd seen the man. She frowned deeply. "He's been causing trouble lately," she said quietly. "A drifter passing through. Folks say he's been hanging around cabins, looking for trouble." Linda offered to drive me back to town. I gratefully accepted. On the ride back, she told me about how the man had been spotted stealing from campsites, breaking into cabins, and scaring people away. The forest had become unsafe, especially at night. The local sheriff's office was trying to track him down but hadn't caught him yet. I felt relief flooding through me as the city lights reappeared in the distance. The fear I'd carried for days began to melt away. That night, back in my apartment in Portland, I lay awake for hours. The memory of the cabin, the silence, the footsteps, and that man's cold eyes stayed with me. But I was safe now, surrounded by people and the noise I'd once wanted to escape. The trip had been meant as a peaceful retreat, but it ended up teaching me something important. Solitude can be a refuge, but it can also be dangerous. The wild isn't always a place of beauty. Sometimes, it's a place where you have to fight to survive. Weeks later, I heard that the man was finally arrested after breaking into a hunter's cabin farther up the mountain. The sheriff's office praised the local community for helping track him down. I never went back to that cabin. The experience stayed with me, a reminder of how fragile safety can be when you're alone in the wilderness. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to spend a few days alone in a remote cabin deep in the Montana wilderness. I was 32 years old then, and after months of a stressful job in the city, I badly needed some time to clear my head and disconnect. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a simple cabin, no electricity, no internet, somewhere I could be completely alone with nature. I found a small rental about 50 miles north of Missoula, a place that locals called Lone Pine Retreat. The cabin was tucked away near the edge of a dense forest, beside a slow-moving creek that made a soft, constant noise. The drive out from the city was long and winding, the roads getting narrower and rougher as I got closer. Eventually, I left the last bit of pavement behind and followed a dirt track that vanished into the trees. The sun was low in the sky when I finally pulled up to the cabin. A simple, weathered wooden structure with a small porch and a rusty metal roof. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe even longer. It wasn't much, but it felt like exactly the kind of place I wanted. The first thing I did was unload my gear. A small backpack with clothes, food, a few books, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a battery-powered radio. There was no cell signal here. I double-checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure before stepping inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and mustiness, but also a faint hint of pine and smoke. There was a small wood stove in the corner, an old metal sink without running water, and a few shelves lined with canned goods left by previous renters. The floor creaked softly beneath my boots, and the only light came from the dying sunset filtering through the grimy windows. I spent the first hour exploring the cabin and its surroundings. Outside, the forest was dense and silent, except for the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves. The creek babbled quietly nearby, a thin mist rising from it as the temperature dropped. The air smelled clean and fresh, a stark contrast to the city smog I'd left behind. Felt good to be here. That first night was peaceful. I built a small fire in the stove, ate some canned beans heated in a pot, and read a book by the flickering light of a battery lamp. The silence outside was complete. No cars, no planes, just the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a coyote. I went to bed early, lying on the thin mattress in the small loft above the main room, and quickly fell asleep. The next morning, I woke early to the pale light creeping through the windows. I brewed some instant coffee on the stove and sat on the porch, staring out at the trees. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows over the forest floor. I planned to hike a nearby trail that led up to a ridge with a view of the valley below. I packed my day pack with water, snacks, and a map I'd found on the cabin's table. The trail was steep but manageable. It wound up through tall pines, patches of wildflowers, and rocky outcrops. I took my time, stopping often to catch my breath and admire the scenery. The air was cool and dry, and the only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional bird call. About halfway up, I found a small clearing with a perfect view of the valley. Rolling hills, patches of farmland, and the distant town shimmering in the morning haze. I sat there for a while, just soaking it in. Then I noticed something odd. A faint trail of footprints in the soft dirt, heading off into the woods. They didn't look fresh, but they were too clear to be old. The prints were small, maybe from a young person or someone with small boots. I followed them cautiously for a few minutes, but they disappeared near a fallen tree. I shrugged it off, probably some other hikers or campers. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was high, and the heat had picked up. I spent the afternoon reading and resting, trying not to think about the footprints. By evening, the sky was turning orange and pink. I lit the stove again, made a simple dinner, and prepared for another night alone. That night, something felt different. As I lay in bed, I heard a faint noise outside, a soft scraping, like something dragging against the cabin wall. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing against the wood. But the sound was slow, deliberate, and kept moving along the side of the building. My heart started to race. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear more, but after a few minutes, the noise stopped. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling, feeling eyes on me from the shadows outside. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves playing tricks. But when I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadows moving between the trees. The following morning, I found fresh scratches on the side of the cabin, near the back door. Thin, deep gouges in the wood, like claws or maybe a knife. I didn't own a knife, so I was sure it was someone else. But why? There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing was missing. I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. I decided to pack up and leave that day. The woods were too quiet now, too empty. Something felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I gathered my things, I noticed the footprints again, this time circling the cabin closer and more frequent. They weren't animal prints. They were boot prints, clearly human. But I hadn't seen anyone else since I arrived. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight and headed for my car, parked about a quarter-mile down the dirt road. The sun was setting, and the shadows grew longer and thicker around me. About halfway to the car, I heard voices, low, muffled, just at the edge of hearing. They didn't call out, just murmured to each other. I stopped and listened, heart pounding, trying to locate them. Then I heard footsteps, quick and heavy, crunching through the underbrush. I picked up my pace, then broke into a run, adrenaline pumping. I didn't look back. The road was narrow, twisting, and uneven, but I made it to the car in less than 5 minutes. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. 2 figures emerged from the trees, standing where the cabin had been visible earlier. They watched me drive off into the darkening forest. The next day, I called the local ranger station from a nearby town. I explained what happened, including the scratches and footprints. They said the area had seen some recent trouble. A group of squatters had been spotted in the woods, some involved in petty theft and drug use. They warned me to avoid staying alone there. I never went back to Lone Pine Retreat. Looking back, I realize how dangerous that trip could have been. The woods are beautiful but unpredictable, and people who come into them with bad intentions can turn a peaceful getaway into a nightmare. I learned to trust my instincts, to pay attention to the signs around me, and most importantly, never underestimate the loneliness and vulnerability of being alone in the wilderness. I remember the trip clearly, even though it was more than a decade ago. It was the summer of 2012, late August, when I decided to take a break from everything: work, city noise, and the endless buzz of people. I was 28 at the time and had recently switched jobs, still trying to figure out what I really wanted in life. I wanted quiet, space, and something different. So, I rented a cabin in the mountains, somewhere remote but still reachable by car, near a small town called Elk Ridge, tucked deep in the pine forests of northern Idaho. The place was perfect for what I wanted. A small, weathered wooden cabin, about 15 miles off the main road, hidden by towering evergreens. It had a simple setup: a small porch, a wood stove inside, a modest kitchen, and just one bedroom. No internet, no cell service, no distractions. Just the forest, the wind, and me. I packed my car with the bare essentials: food, water, firewood, a first aid kit, and a stack of books I never got around to reading. I left on a Friday afternoon, driving for nearly 4 hours until I hit the gravel road that led to the cabin. As I turned onto that rough path, the forest closed in tight, thick and dark. The trees were tall, and the only sounds were birds and the crunch of my tires on the stones. It was quiet in a way that felt strange at first. Too quiet, like the world had just stopped. No traffic, no planes, no voices. When I arrived, the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky with pale orange and pink. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by trees on all sides, with a narrow trail leading down to a stream nearby. I stepped out and took a deep breath. The air smelled like pine needles and earth, fresh and clean. I could already tell this place was different, the kind of place that could change you if you let it. The first night, I made a fire on the stone ring outside the cabin. The crackling wood and dancing flames were comforting, and I cooked some canned beans and rice over the fire, eating slowly while watching the stars come out one by one. It was peaceful, but as the darkness grew, I became aware of every little sound. The rustling of the wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl, the snap of a twig nearby. I wasn't scared, just alert, tuned in to the wildness around me. Inside, the cabin felt cozy but a little chilly. The wood walls creaked and settled, and the floorboards groaned if I moved too fast. I lit a candle and read for a bit, then fell asleep to the sounds of the forest outside. The next day was bright and warm. I spent the morning exploring the woods nearby, following the small stream down to a wider river. The forest was alive with life. Birds flitted through the branches, squirrels scurried along the ground, and the sun filtered through the canopy in patches. It was beautiful and peaceful, but I also noticed something odd. There were no other people around. No footprints on the trail, no signs of hunters or campers. Just me. In the afternoon, I gathered more firewood and restocked my supplies inside the cabin. I had brought a battery-powered lantern, but it was old and flickered, so I mostly used candles and the wood stove for light and heat. As evening came, I lit the fire again and cooked a simple dinner. This time some canned soup heated on the stove. The wind had picked up, and I could hear it whistling through the trees and rattling the cabin's shutters. That night, around 11 p.m., something strange happened. I was just about to put out the candle and head to bed when I heard a noise outside, near the edge of the clearing. It was a low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled over rocks. It was faint but clear enough to freeze me in place. My heart started to beat faster, not because I was scared, but because I didn't understand what it was. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. The forest was black and thick, the moon hidden behind clouds. I shone the beam of light toward the noise. Nothing. I called out, but my voice seemed swallowed by the trees. The noise stopped. After a moment, I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, or maybe a bear dragging something. Still, the sound didn't quite match anything I had ever heard before. I went back inside and locked the door, though it felt silly. I stayed awake for hours, listening to every little sound. There were distant howls or cries. I couldn't tell what. Maybe coyotes, maybe something else. The next morning, I noticed something on the porch. There were scratch marks on the wooden step, deep, jagged lines gouged into the wood. They didn't look like the work of any animal I knew. Bears and deer left claw or hoof marks, but these looked different, larger, messier. I didn't want to panic or jump to conclusions. I was alone after all, and maybe the marks were old. Still, I kept my pocket knife handy and made sure to double-check the locks on the doors and windows. That day, I decided to hike further into the woods, hoping to clear my mind and distract myself. The forest thickened as I walked, the trees closing in tighter. The trail became narrower and less defined, but I kept going. The sound of the stream was distant now, replaced by the soft crunch of my boots on the pine needles and leaves. After about an hour, I came to a small clearing with an old abandoned cabin ruin. Just a shell of a building, roof caved in, walls half fallen. The place looked like it hadn't been touched for decades. I explored cautiously, noting rusty cans and broken glass on the ground, old newspapers yellowed and crumbling. I wondered who had lived there and why they left. As I turned to head back, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud near the edge of the clearing. They were large and uneven, like someone had been walking clumsily or carrying something heavy. I followed them for a short distance but lost the trail where the forest grew thicker. A shiver ran down my spine. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe there were other people hiking or hunting nearby. Still, I felt watched. That evening, I made the fire early and stayed close to the cabin. I double-checked all the windows and doors and covered the windows with blankets to block any light from inside. I didn't want to attract attention. Around 10 p.m., the noise started again. This time, it was louder, a dragging, scraping sound coming from the edge of the clearing. It was as if something heavy was being pulled over rocks and dirt, closer than before. I held my breath and listened. Then came a sharp crack, like a branch breaking under weight. I grabbed my flashlight again, shining it toward the sound. Suddenly, a large shape burst out of the tree line and ran toward the cabin. It was a man, rough, dirty clothes, face half hidden by a scruffy beard, his eyes wild and desperate. I froze. He stopped about 20 feet from the cabin and looked around wildly, like he was afraid of being followed. I didn't speak or move. He crouched and pulled something heavy behind him, a large sack, tied and bulging with something inside. After a tense moment, he glanced directly at the cabin and then bolted back into the woods, disappearing as quickly as he had come. I stood there stunned, heart pounding. Who was he? What was in that sack? Why was he dragging it through the forest at night, looking so terrified? The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, my hands shaking. The forest no longer felt peaceful, felt like a trap. Before I left, I looked around the clearing carefully, hoping to find some clue about the man or what he was doing. Near the edge of the trees, I found some more scratch marks and a small pile of broken branches and disturbed leaves. I walked down to the stream and saw a few drops of dried blood on the rocks. The thought hit me hard. This wasn't just some random hiker. Something had gone terribly wrong here. I drove away slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror at the cabin shrinking behind me, swallowed again by the forest. Back in town, I told the local ranger about what I'd seen, the cabin, the marks, the man dragging the sack. He looked serious but said there had been reports of illegal hunting and poachers in the area. People sometimes hid in the woods to avoid the law, and violence wasn't unheard of. He advised me to stay out of the forest at night and be careful if I went back. I never returned. The experience stayed with me for years. The feeling of being watched, the strange man, the dragging noise at night. It was a harsh reminder that even the quietest places have their dangers. Not ghosts or monsters, just real people and real threats. The forest doesn't care about us, and sometimes neither do the people who hide inside it.